Hello everyone, Yom Tov, and welcome to your Real Crime Stories. Now, here's a weird thing, and sorry by the way for my appearance, I've had a bit of a dicky tummy for the last couple of days, so I was feeling a bit weak and wobbly, as you do. But no, not to worry, because I'm here and delivering. I was going to do the St. Valentine's Day Massacre for you, but every time I tried to sort of find out things about that, the person who I'm going to talk about tonight just kept leaping out at me. So I thought, I wonder if there's a reason behind that. So I decided to tell you about him instead. And it's not somebody that I know of particularly well when it comes to known gangsters of the 20s and 30s in America. But I'm going to tell you about Babyface Nelson. And this was a guy who literally sort of died the way he more or less lived, from the end of a gun. So I'm going to tell you about Babyface Nelson tonight and exactly the sort of things that he got up to in the 1920s and 1930s America. So he was actually known as Public Enemy Number 1. And I'll tell you a bit about him and about the backstory. Well, the 1930s was the golden era, you could more or less say, of, bootleggers and, bank robberies and bootlegging. I think I've said bootleggers, yes I have. Sorry about that. Just general bad guys. Movies were being made about all these bad guys and speakeasies and, if you could do a bad thing with being faced, down the barrel of a gun, then that's what you did. So you had people around like Al Capone and Bugsy Moran and Bugsy Siegel and Babyface Nelson, John Dillinger, people like that, Bonnie and Clyde, that infamous couple, they went down in a haze of bullets. You had the likes of Ma Barker and her 4 sons. So it was that particular period of time just seemed to be filled with gangsters, mobsters. The mafia was really sort of extending its grip. Loan shark, and what today we would know as loan sharks, would have people leaning on you. You would have Italian families up against, so you'd have like Italian gangs, and then you'd have the Irish gangs, then you'd have the Jewish gangs, you'd have Polish gangs. But I think the most notorious, obviously, were the Italian, the mafia, the mafiosa, where it was, if you ratted, that sort of thing. But anyway, I'll get into this. So, among the most infamous of all of these was Babyface Nelson, who was born Lester Joseph Gillis, and he was born on December the 6th, 1908, in Chicago, Illinois. And of course, Chicago was all the Chicago mobsters. I mean, Al Capone was part of that set, so, enough said. His official FBI biography states that he began his life of crime roaming the streets of Chicago with a gang of juvenile hoodlums in his early teens, leading to his first term of incarceration in 1922 at the age of just 14. So I think that young Leslie, who became known as Babyface Nelson, and that was because he looked younger than his years, and at his full height he was only 5'4". So by today's standards, he would look like a kid. So there you go. And his life of crime ended up in a hail of bullets at the age of 25. But before that, believe you me, he definitely made his mark on the FBI and, you know, history's Hall of the Infamous when it comes to American gangsters and killers. He actually did enjoy killing. He loved killing just for the sake of it, and he'd go out of his way to kill. Right, before he became a hardened killer, a teenage Babyface Nelson started out stealing tyres and cars. He was bootlegging and committing armed robberies. On one occasion in early 1930, he and some accomplices raided the home of a wealthy magazine owner and made off with jewellery that would be worth about $3 million in today's money. And then later that year, he stole an enormous stash of jewellery from none other than the mayor of Chicago's wife. Right, a few months after that $3 million heist, he carried out his first major bank robbery. And that this was something that he would repeat over and over again over the years to come. And it was always with this same gang of these amateur thugs that he carried out all of these crimes. Like I said, he became known as Babyface because of his short stature and boyish appearance. And with his new nickname firmly in place, and he had his wife as his partner in crime, she was called Helen. She was always along for the ride. Nelson would graduate to much bloodier crimes that would bring him to the attention of law enforcement, the media, and the American zeitgeist itself. In fact, Nelson's one of the storied few in American history who held the title of the FBI's public enemy #1. And according to an article in the New York Times in 1934, he'd reached his peak after spending half of his 26 years being an outlaw. And what's more, he holds the record, still to this day, of killing the most FBI agents at any one time. He killed 3, all in one go. And no other killer's ever done that. So he still holds that record today. He also associated an awful lot with John Dillinger. I'll talk about John Dillinger in a further video. His partnership with Dillinger was particularly profitable for all the outlaws concerned because they robbed a string of banks for large amounts of money. But unlike many other murderous gangsters of the 1930s, Nelson himself, he was the one who led the killing. He had a particular bloodlust that none of the others shared. He was the one who really gloried in killing people. He apparently made up for his short stature by being very, very handy with a blade and even handier with a gun. It's almost as if he had to compensate for the fact that he was so short. So he needed to stand tall in other areas. So when it came to stabbing or slitting throats or generally dismembering people, disfiguring them or taking them out with a gun, he was first in line to do it. It was said that where outlaws such as Pretty Boy Floyd and the Barkers, Ma Barker and her sons, would kill to protect themselves when cornered, Babyface Nelson went out of his way to murder, and he loved it. His angelic, pear-smooth face never betrayed his instant ability to kill and his love of killing. Now, in April 1934, he was vacationing at the Little Bohemia Lodge in the remote northern Wisconsin, accompanied by his wife and members of the Dillinger gang. The FBI learned of their whereabouts on April the 22nd, 1934, and dispatched agents to the scene. Luckily for Nelson, barking dogs alerted the gangsters, and they slipped out at the back of the lodge into the darkness. He fled to a nearby home where he took 2 hostages. Special agents W. Carter Baum and J.C. Newman, along with local constable Carl C. Christensen, arrived on the scene before Nelson could make another uncontested getaway. He rushed the lawman's car and ordered them to exit the vehicle. However, before they could comply, Nelson opened fire with his .45 automatic, hitting all 3 of them, and he killed Special Agent Baum instantly. He then made his escape using the FBI car. Meanwhile, the FBI agents and the self-appointed deputies continued shooting at the Little Bohemia Lodge, and when they realised the gangsters had escaped and the battle that Little Bohemia Lodge had ended at dawn, they then went on to apprehend a cadre of female stragglers, which included Nelson's wife Helen, who was arrested but she soon got out on parole. Now, while he evaded capture at the Little Bohemia Lodge, it was just a matter of months before the law actually did finally catch up with him. And in the early hours of November the 27th, FBI agents found Nelson about 60 miles from Chicago. A few minutes later, another agent spotted him driving in a stolen car, and he was able to get hold of the number plate. The license, well, Brits call it number plates. Americans call it the license plate. They managed to get a hold of that number. And it was then that Nelson's wife and a guy called John Paul Chase, that was one of his long-term partners in crime, accompanied Babyface on what turned out to be his final hours of life. Shortly after that, an Inspector Samuel P. Cowley of the FBI Chicago office received word that Nelson was heading towards Chicago in a stolen vehicle. He immediately dispatched agents Bill Ryan and Tom McDade to look for Nelson's car and headed out in a second car along with an agent, Herman Ed Hollis. A little more than an hour after Nelson's initial encounter with the FBI, agents Dowd and McDade spotted Ryan and McDade, spotted Nelson driving on the highway and began the pursuit. A firefight ensued and Agent Ryan managed to shoot the radiator of Nelson's car and then raced ahead and pulled over. From there, agents Cowley and Hollis passed Nelson on the highway and began following him. His car was obviously disabled because the radiator had been shot out. So he pulled off the road at the entrance to the Northside Park in Barrington, Illinois. Cowley and Hollis stopped their car about 150 feet away. Nelson and Chase opened fire on them with automatic weapons before agents could exit their vehicle. The gun battle, which reportedly lasted 4 to 5 minutes, claimed the life of Agent Hollis. Agent Cowley was also mortally wounded during the skirmish. Nelson received 17 gunshot wounds and was helped into the FBI's car by Chase, and they rode off. But finally succumbing to his numerous wounds, Babyface Nelson took his last breath around about 8 o'clock in Wilmette, Illinois. Agent Cowley, having survived the shootout initially, didn't make it far into the next day. He died in the early morning hours of November the 28th, cementing Nelson into the annals of history as a horrifying bane to law enforcement. So that was the 3 FBI agents who were killed. So that was Baum, Hollis and Cowley. Later the same day, responding to an anonymous tip, FBI agents found Nelson's body in a ditch by a cemetery near Niles Center, Illinois. His now widowed wife, Helen, spent the duration of the firefight safely lying prone in a field, hiding from the flurry of bullets flying between the fugitives and the FBI. She escaped the scene in a stolen FBI vehicle with Nelson and Chase. The FBI picked up Nelson 2 days later after that fateful battle. She pleaded guilty to violating her parole and was sentenced to serve 1 year and 1 day at a federal women's prison, which was located about 50 miles outside of Detroit in Michigan. As for her husband, his criminal career spanned from petty teenage shenanigans to the FBI naming him public enemy number 1 and literally person most wanted in the United States. His short life was a high-speed onslaught of villainy that showcased a delight in killing, and that was hardly even seen among fictional gangsters, let alone real-life ones. There was nobody enjoyed killing as much as he did. And this very fact alone secured his infamy among law enforcement, among the FBI, and basically, I suppose you could say that he was classified as one of the most villainous criminals that the United States at that time had ever known. I mean, we're not calling him a serial killer. I know we've known much worse, like the likes of Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and, Dennis Nielsen and Ed Gein and people like that. I know we've seen a lot worse. But you're talking about the 20s and 30s here, where life was different. And at that time, where the majority of people, where they were recovering. They weren't just recovering, but they were about to go into the Great Depression. And then they went through that, then they were coming out the other side of the Great Depression. And people were finding it hard to make ends meet, basically. And it was a matter of survival. And people were generally sort of law-abiding, peaceful, church-going. So to have somebody like him on the scene, I suppose, was not only made at a time we should be fearful, but I suppose it would be exciting. And there would be, if they went to the movies, you would see write-ups about these people along on the movie reels. So there was this element of great fear, but of excitement as well. So that, my friends, is tonight's true crime for you. Babyface Nelson. And I'm not quite sure how long I've actually been talking to you now, but I'll tell you what I do know about Ma Barker and her 4 sons. I do know that she wasn't exactly the prettiest of women, and she married a guy called George Barker, who was a farmer, and they had 4 sons. I can't remember all the names. One was called, his nickname was Doc. One was called Fred. And all 4 boys had their own gang, and they were also linked with another gang called Capisi or something like that. I can't remember. I am terrible for remembering names. I really am bad. But they had this gang between the Barker boys, and I think it was this guy called Albert Capisi or something like that. Well, anyway, they generally went about and they were bank robbing and literally whatever they could get their hands on with regard to money, bonds, goods, you name it, they were in on it. And for all Ma Barker allegedly never ever killed anybody, J. Edgar Hoover decided that, something had to be done about her. And she was notorious for getting her sons out of jail by doing the Weeping Mother Act, weeping and moaning for her poor sons as she She was just a mother and she was crying for her sons. So 9 times out of 10, she managed to get them out, at least on parole, where they would just go on and do some more scallywagging here, there and everywhere. And scallywagging, I know, is putting it mildly. But anyway, J. Edgar Hoover thought it would be a really good idea to set his sights on Ma Barker, and he instructed that she had to be taken out. And there was a general outcry, apparently, when she was shot dead, because she was 63. And the general outcry was because here was a mother who was only protecting her 4 sons, and wicked old J. Edgar Hoover, who they didn't know at the time was a cross-dresser and had a male lover, had decided to take the life of a woman in her 60s. And that was a terrible thing to do. Now, as a mother myself, if either of my 2 got involved in crime, as much as I love them, I would hand them over to the police. I would, because it's the right thing to do. It would break my heart, but it's the right thing to do. Ma Barker didn't do that. Whatever her sons did, she was always pleading their innocence and begging them to be released, and on promises that they'd behave. But she was living on the proceeds of the things they stole, and they shot their way out of it. And they were shooting people as well. Like I say, I don't know whether she ever killed anyone. She reported that she didn't. But she was still able to profit from the stuff that they were doing. So she was condoning their behaviour. But it was just the case of cutting the head off the snake sort of thing. I don't think J. Edgar Hoover did the right thing there. But then again, I'm not him. And this was, I believe it was 1935, sometime like that. So it's not really for me to judge. Only for me to have a quick look at, which is basically all I did. Because talking about Ma Barker, that it's amazing how little information there is out there about her. When I went to look, it was all fragmented. So I was able to bring up bits and pieces at a time. When I went to look for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, there's the only place that had anything near decent information was Wikipedia. I found that amazing. I thought there would have been reams written about it in places. And I have been looking. I really have been looking. So I found that a bit strange, considering that it's well known. I mean, saying that, I did ask my kids today if they'd heard of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. They hadn't heard of it. Never heard of John Dillinger. Never heard of Al Capone. And it was like, stunned. So, but of course, I was born in 1960, so these were still names that were up and about and talked about when I was a child. So, there you go. So, I will leave this with you tonight. I do hope that you've enjoyed the video that I brought to you. I know it hasn't been exactly perfect, and I am sorry about that. Believe you me, when you get in a bad tummy, it literally leaves you feeling, dried out after a long squawk. Trust me on that one. But I will do better next time, I promise you that. But I did want to bring you something. I didn't want to leave you with nothing. So, but if you want to look up Babyface Nelson, I was horrified to find out that there's actually a picture of him lying dead in a morgue where 4 deputies are standing over him, pointing out his bullet wounds. That was a bit gruesome. But anyway, you can find out more about him. It's not a huge amount, but the bit I found was, I think, enough to tell you about him. At least, you know, if you haven't heard of him before, I brought him back to life for you, and I think there's probably a reason why. Maybe he wanted to be talked about, who knows? Never know these days, do you? Right, I shall bid you a fond adieu, and I will see you all again very, very soon. Please take care of yourselves, and I love you all, okay? And I promise you, you will see me again very, very soon. Take care, everybody. Love you. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.